two very stimulating presentations to reintroduce to you the European Union and its place in the wider scheme of things. We've got about 15 minutes for questions and perhaps comment before we break the morning tea. Would somebody like to get the ball rolling? Do we have a particular question?
I think one of the key elements of Europe is that you've got land borders on the continent, at least. And that means that there are relations across borders which we don't take for granted here, because we're an island continent. Even New Zealand isn't sufficiently a challenge for institutional arrangements in Australia. When something happens in France, it's picked up by the Swiss, it's picked up by the Italians, picked up by the Germans, because they don't want to stay behind the French, and so on. So, and land borders mean that you marry across. We've done that for 100 years. Even for farmers who live close to the border, you know, if the girl from across the border brings more land, then she's a better candidate for my son than another woman within this same state. So we're dealing in Europe in most cases with land borders, and you marry across, and borders have changed over time. I mean, all borders in Europe on the continent have changed repeatedly over the last 200 years. And we don't have that experience here. There was a time, we shouldn't forget, when Victoria was a high tariff country and New South Wales was a free trade country. And there was tariff collected on the Murray River. But even for youth today, that is 100 years ago. So there are marked differences. On the other hand, we need to understand these differences in order to present them to the students, to remind them of that.
So your point is that the land border makes for easier integration,
Explains
easier connections. Yeah. Other comments or questions following from that?
Yes, so following on from what you're saying, then the land borders between Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia, say, would that have helped the Federation of Australia in 1901 and future integration?
And between Australia and New Zealand, now it's all right for academics to see opportunities for unification of some sort, but the farmer in Winand and in Queensland or in rural New South Wales doesn't see the need for that.
Mm-hmm. You're not talking about academics with Australia and New Zealand, you're talking about politicians and policy
academics and politicians and some of the unions and businesses that they see advantages in unification.
I think Annmarie's point would be we have a single market with Australia and New Zealand to a very significant degree. Pricing, tariff, we don't have tariffs. We don't have barriers to mobility, labour mobility.
I'm sorry, my son who runs a business in Melbourne for a German company was going to present something in New Zealand for one day, and he had to go through the procedures. There are no tariffs to take his goods from here to New Zealand and back, but he had to go through all the legal import regulations and so on. It was incredibly difficult to get things from here to there and back again, because that hasn't been worked out. There is no tariff, but there are all sorts of non-tariff barriers, which are far more important when you're dealing in low-tariff environment.
Some of that would still apply in Europe as well.
Yes, of course. I guess the interesting thing about the idea of a single market is that once it's implemented, we tend to then think, oh, we've got a single market. But of course, it's not done on the day after you sign a bit of paper. And as anybody who works in the EU will know, the single market is not finished. There's still many areas that require work for the thing to work properly. And we're exactly the same with New Zealand. I mean, the truth is we do have, is it 1 million Kiwis now living in Australia? There's a lot of people movement, and there's a lot of movement generally. There are still non-tariff barriers, but a lot of these are about exactly the point that you made, which is we don't have a land border, so we have massive quarantine issues, which is probably the non-tariff barriers that you're talking about. aside from quarantine, we have hardly any restrictions on trade between Australia and New Zealand. It's one of the most liberal trading regimes gone, and has been for a long time. But, you know, you can't eliminate everything on the first day. And that's what's interesting in some ways about single markets. I mean, like I said, they're a work in progress, and they always have to be because there are legal and other issues coming up all the time.
Yes.
So, probably extend that a little bit. To what extent is the economics then overriding the nationalistic differences in Europe? You know, the gains that you can make through economic in the top market.
I mean, good question. That's the question in a way, isn't it? Because the cooperation between Australia, yes, the cooperation between Australia and New Zealand was set up for entirely different reasons, wasn't it? We weren't trying to ensure peace between Australia and New Zealand, because aside from fighting about sport, we've never really disagreed that much. So, whereas the history of European integration is precisely about conflict and preventing further conflict. So they're set up for quite different reasons. But it's interesting that on the economic side, they've ended up doing quite similar things, and getting really stuck into what we call non-tariff barriers or behind-the-border barriers, and complex regulatory issues which governments are trying to kind of sort out to make sure there can be more trade. But it's interesting they've ended up with a similar sort of list of, a similar to-do list, even though they were set up originally for quite different purposes.
Yes, please.
Just a follow-up to the idea of nationalism. I'm just wondering to what extent the global financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis has, in your view, and knowing the EU so well, has, to what extent has nationalism like re-emerged as a threat to integration, if at all?
Pascaline?
Thinking of the spat between the sort of
nationalism
Germany and
has
Greece.
re-emerged.
Sorry, can you
Yeah, nationalism has re-emerged as a consequence of this. That's definitely true. Yes, but also because you have to look at the economic consequences. I guess for people, the EU is supposed to deliver, right? It was supposed to deliver prosperity, and when you mentioned, the economic dimension. When you look at the beginning of the European project, yes, it was about peace, but the recipe for peace was to put the problems, of Europe on the table and try to find a common interest. And so coal and steel that were problems, that were war-making industries in a way, were then used to make peace in a way. So that's the genius of it. And so today, is the EU delivering? Well, there is unemployment. If you look at your pocketbook, well, it's not feeling that way right now. For youth, there is, in some countries, it's very difficult to find jobs. And so maybe the EU is not delivering quite the way it was supposed to, so I guess it can also fuel nationalism. I think Ben could talk about what's happening in the UK. We've written a lot about that.
All right, well, I'll just say a little bit, because it's sort of strayed onto my area of expertise, which is nationalism and European integration. So I think I'll endorse what Pascaline's just said there, in that there has been certainly a populist response to the Eurozone crisis, and this plays out in different ways. And if we say the German and the Greek example, what it does is kind of revive memories of conflict through which people analyse current problems, right? And so what's happened around the margins of politics is a growth of populist parties. And if we take the United Kingdom as an example, then we've seen the growth of what looks like a single issue, let's get written out of the EU party, which is doing really quite well in various different electoral formats at the moment. It's polling quite strongly, but at the same time, it's also tied up with policies of anti-immigration. So when you take all those kind of economic difficulties that Pascaline's mentioned, and you add on to that the kind of one of the four freedoms, which is the free movement of labour, you start to get quite a volatile mix. So on the 1st of January this year, the restrictions on the movement of Bulgarian and Romanian citizens throughout the EU were lifted, and particularly in the United Kingdom, there had been a kind of a strong reaction against this happening. The idea was that poor people from the east were going to be sort of flooding west. So there are those sort of two main dimensions. There's the kind of the failure of success or material success that the EU has been predicated on really since the kind of, you know, it was a way of overcoming conflict, but I think that motivated some of the founders, but not all of them. Right? And some of the subsequent proponents of European integration, that's been a lesser concern for them. It's about material gain. And so once that stops happening, you're left with a sort of one of the crises of legitimacy, and the question is, you know, has integration proceeded too fast? Has it gone ahead of kind of popular, well, it used to rest in some sense on popular apathy, but maybe that's gone and been replaced by a kind of a populist negativity towards European integration. So the nationalist thing is there. There's another side to the nationalist story, which is that, you know, one's national interests are best served by integration, and you hear that argument in certain places. But it's a kind of a nationalist popular reaction against the EU and other governments, so it's a domestic European problem as well. But I digress, because I'll talk about this a bit later on to that. But yes, you're right.
You've obviously unlocked an interesting topic to pursue.
Do you think that the...
Sorry, can you speak up?
I'm sorry. Do you think the economic downturn has had an impact on the Scottish and Catalonian bids for breaking away and sort of being national entities on their own?
It's a question about Catalonia and Scotland.
Okay. Yes, in different ways. So Catalonia is, you know, what we used to see in nationalist developments, not just in Europe but in other parts of the world, was that
in 5 minutes' time, at 11 o'clock, there will be a free family tour of the museum with a feathery tour guide. Gimme the hour. We'll start in the first floor foyer at 11 o'clock. See you there.
But you will get morning.
So what used to happen is that poor parts of the world used to sort of want to break away from richer parts of the world.
Just repeating that again. 5 minutes' time, at 11 o'clock, there will be a free family tour of the museum with a feathery tour guide. Gimme the hour. We'll start in the first floor foyer at 11 o'clock. See you there.
Try again.
Okay, I'll try again. So poor bits of the world used to want to break away from rich parts of the world in order to become rich themselves. And the idea was that they didn't have control of the means of their own development. That was the idea. In some parts of Europe now we see the opposite, that rich parts of the world want to develop, get rid of poor parts because they're holding them back. And I think that explains Catalan nationalism. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff about language and so on, which are equally important. But in terms of your question about the crisis itself, so Spain has not performed well during this period of crisis. Catalonia is still sort of comparatively rich, and it has been autonomous for centuries in different forms, apart from a Franco interlude. So in some senses they're seeking to break away from the rest of poor Spain. In Scotland it's a little bit different. It's more like the old model, that somehow central government in London is not kind of helping Scottish development. And that's what motivates Scotland, is to sort of a reassertion of autonomy. And it's based partly on notions about there being oil wealth to be had, so Norway becomes a model. It's based partly on looking across the Irish Sea to Ireland and seeing Ireland as a successful model despite the Eurozone crisis within the EU. So the argument about Scotland being within the EU is very important, but so the Eurozone crisis is a sort of a rod with which those people who want Britain to stay together can beat the secessionists, because they say, well, you're going to have to join the Euro, even though you say you're not, you're going to have to. And also, especially a few years ago when things were looking bad, so well, why would you want to sort of like become independent and lose your autonomy again in an EU that is struggling? Now, as the EU sort of comes out of the fiscal dimension of its crisis, that argument is weakening. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily a causal factor in Scotland's case, but it's certainly an important context for the secessionists to make their argument.
Time for one or two, perhaps last questions of Pascaline and Annmarie before we break for morning tea. Yes, thank you.
I was just interested in it, if anyone wanted to, I like the idea of comparing other types of integration, and I just wondered if anyone wanted to comment on the African Union. My students are very interested in the African Union, so some of the comparisons, differences.
Yes, thanks for the question, and I don't know a lot about the African Union. Yes, it's that would be a great comparison to make with students. I think it's one of those cases where we could see some aspirations and some language adopted, even just lifted straight out of the EU context and used. But it's also a case where we can probably see some examples where integration hasn't progressed as far as people hoped. And hasn't progressed in the same sort of way. So it's one of those cases, I think, where we could say some of the language has been adopted, some of the institutional structure is sometimes referred to. We might not see, however, the same sort of concrete outcomes that we can see in the case of the EU or in the Trans-Tasman case. And that's for all sorts of reasons that make perfect sense in context. But that would be another great comparison. I mean, there's a whole list of interesting comparisons to be made about countries trying to do integration in different ways, and sometimes they're small cases. I mean, Australia and New Zealand is a very small case. It's nowhere near on the scale of the 28 EU members, but it is a very advanced case. In other cases, we can see big groupings of countries aspiring to similar things, but actually not making that much progress. Or sometimes they're set up for different reasons altogether. So APEC is very much a trade-focused organisation. It's got an entirely different sort of membership and background. But you can make all of those different comparisons with the students in order to get them to think about different parts of the world and why this works in one spot, or appears to work, and why it's progressed a long way, and then in other places why it doesn't seem to fly. So I think, good idea.
It's also interesting to see how the African Union works together with the United Nations and the EU as well. That's something really interesting to explore.
There was an article in The Economist 2 or 3 weeks ago about the 3 monetary unions that are developed in Africa. There is the one, 2 of them are French dominated, and the other one is East Africa. And they set guidelines for development in the next 2 years. And the one furthest developed is the one involving the western part of West Africa. Not the Arab Union, but Sierra Leone, Mauritania, and so on.
Okay, thank you. On that note about monetary union, let's draw an end to this first session. Thank you very much indeed to Pascaline and Annmarie, very much about laying out the ground about the European Union and pointing to some of the issues that are not necessarily just bubbling away, perhaps popping away in quite some scale that we'll be coming back to later on during the day. Thank you very much indeed, that was terrific, and thank you for your contributions already.